Welcome to the podcast, How to Be Well and Strong. I'm your host, Jacqueline Genova, and I'm excited to have you join me as I speak with some of the leading figures in the fields of wellness, integrative medicine, and mental health, as we discover what it truly means to be well and strong in both body and mind. Get ready to be empowered, inspired, and motivated about being an advocate for your own health. Autoimmune disease is an extremely common and growing issue in our global population, affecting millions of people worldwide. Autoimmune diseases vary in symptoms and severity, but they all have one thing in common: the body is attacking itself. In this episode, I speak with Dr. Amy Myers about some of the causes of autoimmune disease, the difference in a conventional versus functional treatment approach, and how to optimize your nutrition and lifestyle to put symptoms into remission. Dr. Amy Myers is a two-time New York Times bestselling author and internationally acclaimed medical and functional medicine physician. She specializes in empowering those with autoimmune, thyroid, and digestive issues to take back their health and reverse their condition. After 2.5 years of service with the Peace Corps in Paraguay, Dr. Myers set off on a journey that would lead her to later launch a world-famous functional medicine clinic and her content and line of programs, supplements, and beauty products, an over $30 million wellness business, earning a spot on the Inc. 5000 list of fastest-growing American companies for 3 years running, and serving the health needs of hundreds of thousands of people in 60 countries around the globe. Without further ado, here's our conversation. Dr. Myers, welcome to the show. I've been a fan of your work for a long time, so I am beyond excited to really just sit down and pick your brain on a topic that has affected not only myself, but millions of people around the world, and that is autoimmune disease.
I'm so happy to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Of course. Before we start, Dr. Myers, everyone has a story as to how they ended up in the health space, particularly in the functional medicine field. You have quite an incredible story, and I'd love for you to share a bit about that with our listeners.
Sure. I'll try to give you the Cliff Notes version since it's kind of long. But let's see. I graduated from college with a degree in psychology, had various jobs, and ultimately found myself in the U.S. Peace Corps in Paraguay, South America. And I was really interested in learning about natural medicine there. So I learned all about medicinal herbs. I taught myself yoga. I'd grown up with parents who were very holistic, so to speak. It was in the 70s. My mother taught yoga. We ate homemade whole wheat bread, homemade yogurt. We had a garden. So we were not really eating any processed food, even as a child. When I got back from the Peace Corps, I moved out to Seattle, Washington to potentially go to Bastyr. Now, I'd been a psychology major, so I needed to go back and get all of my post-bac, pre-med studies. So I had 2 more years ahead of me to do all of that, and I did that at the University of Washington. And thought that I would end up at Bastyr to do, naturopathic medicine, and was doing some research with some other doctors. And I noticed that the MDs were getting paid twice what the NDs were getting paid. And I thought, okay, I'm living in Seattle. This is the forefront school, supposed to be widely respected. And clearly they're not respected the same way, that they're not getting paid the same. So it's kind of an eye opener for me to realize, well, I was from Louisiana, and naturopaths at the time were not even licensed there. So how is this really going to work? So long story short, I decided to go to allopathic medical school. My mother was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. In fact, yesterday was the 24th anniversary of her death. She passed away 4 months later. And I moved back to New Orleans to take care of her. And so I only applied to medical schools there. I did all my electives in integrative health, and I really didn't know about functional medicine at that time. I only knew about more integrative health and Dr. Andrew Weil, who I did end up doing a month-long rotation with my 4th year of medical school.
Wow.
But my 2nd year of medical school, I got diagnosed with Graves' disease. And really, I'd reached out to Andrew Weil. I did all kinds of research. I could find no alternative or holistic way to treat my Graves' disease. I tried Chinese medicine first. It was horrible. It wasn't helping. And so I reluctantly went on the medication PTU, which was recommended to me. And within a couple of weeks, I was had crusty nose and dry skin, and my hair was falling out, and I was exhausted. So I went back to the doctor, and he did some liver tests and I was 1 in a million. I got toxic hepatitis, which is a reaction to the medication. And so I had very elevated liver enzymes. I was told, go home, get in bed, and figure out if I wanted to have my thyroid ablated or have it surgically removed.
How old were you at that point?
I was in my early 30s. So I went back to medical school somewhat late, I guess. And so then I became raging hyperthyroid because I couldn't take the medication. I almost had to drop out of medical school because I was missing so much work, but I had an incredible pathology partner and he helped tutor me and get me through it all. But it was a really difficult time. So I opted to have my thyroid ablated, which is radioactive iodine 131, where it blows up your thyroid like Hiroshima. And then, of course, I had all the aftermath of that, of what they call thyroid dumping, where my thyroid was sort of, dumping a bunch of hormones. So I would get, anxious when that would happen, to then become hypothyroid. And then they wait till you're hypothyroid before they put you on thyroid hormone. So it was quite the roller coaster for a number of years. But but because I was so interested in what we now know as functional medicine, I was able to advocate for myself and ask for T3. And at the time, all there was Cytomel. And so I was able to talk to my doctor also because I was a medical student. I think they took me, a little differently in terms of being open-minded to try things. Ultimately, I graduated from medical school. I became an ER physician because I still had not found functional medicine. I had done a rotation with Andrew Weil, and just it wasn't resonating with me as to what I really wanted to do. It didn't seem like it was really getting to the root the way that functional medicine does. And so I thought, well, if I can't really find what I'm looking for, I can at least go practice internationally and do third world medicine. After being a Peace Corps volunteer, I've witnessed all kinds of, needs for physicians. And so I became an ER doctor, and then eventually went to a conference, found out about functional medicine, and really just dove straight in to functional medicine. And within a year had opened my own functional medicine clinic and retired from the ER.
Wow. That's incredible. Obviously, I feel like it really takes something as significant as what you went through, right, to really want to change the system so that other folks don't necessarily have to go through what you yourself did.
Absolutely. Conventional medicine failed me. And so I say it's my mission to not have it fail you too. So I knew that, my thyroid had already been ablated, but I knew that there had to be another way. And so that's, what I looked for and ultimately used with my patients. And even though conventional medicine solved my thyroid by ablating it, it really hadn't gotten to the underlying issue of why I had it in the first place. And so that's really what functional medicine does. And what I spent the next, decade practicing on myself, and then ultimately on my patients as well. And then, wrote a few books. So autoimmunity is when your body is beginning to attack itself. And so, for example, Hashimoto's is an autoimmune condition of your thyroid where your body is attacking the thyroid. Rheumatoid arthritis is where your body is attacking your joints. And so there are more systemic autoimmune conditions. And then, of course, there are very, specific autoimmune conditions to a specific area or organ of the body. I would say Hashimoto's is one of the top. Of course, rheumatoid arthritis is, MS is. The list is sort of endless. I think we're seeing a lot more neuromuscular degenerative diseases as well. Those seem to be on the rise.
And typically, too, would you agree that when someone has one autoimmune disease, it's likely that they have more than one?
So the research does show that once you have one, you're 3 times as likely to get another, which was getting back to my point, even though conventional medicine had ablated my thyroid. So in their mind, they got rid of my Graves' disease. But really, I had a fire still brewing, usually in your gut. The first place I start is to heal the gut. And if I didn't deal with that fire, I was leaving myself open to another autoimmune condition. And I certainly don't want to diminish anyone who has had Graves or Hashimoto's, but those are relatively easily treated, provided that you're on the right form of thyroid hormone. You can live a relatively normal life. It's generally not painful. It's not crippling. And so, certainly if you're going to have an autoimmune condition, that's the one I'd want to have. And, could have been leaving myself open to something much more severe and life affecting like scleroderma or MS or lupus or something that really can be very debilitating and even eventually life threatening if you don't get it under control. So yes, that's what I told my patients. And when we have, followers asking questions, well, I'm already on Synthroid or Armor, why do I even need to do this? It's like, well, it's so that you don't get something else, really.
The conventional approach, Dr. Myers, to autoimmune disease, I feel like is truly a great representation of how most of modern medicine addresses problems, right?
And give pills. Yes, I actually was recently flying back from Austin to Albuquerque or Santa Fe. And there was a woman sitting next to me, and she sat down and her bag sort of opened up, and I saw all of these prescription pills. And then anyway, I asked to help her to put her bag up, and she said, "Oh yeah, I'm suffering from MS." And I said, "Oh, do you know Terry Walls? She's written this incredible book. And also there's another book, The Autoimmune Solution. I actually wrote it." And she was like, "Oh, what is that?" I said, "Well, it's diet and lifestyle nutrition ways to help reverse." She's had incredible success. I've had incredible success, doing this. And she just, went blank, just like not interested, totally like changed the subject, didn't even want to hear.
I wonder if that's a factor of age. I mean, was she relatively older?
She did look like she was, I don't know, but yes, in her 60s or possibly 70s. I don't know.
Yeah, I feel like that's also a generational thing where, at least in my experience, older folks tend to take, the doctor's word as gospel, right? And they don't necessarily question anything. And I'm always encouraging, my grandma, for example, to maybe not take the statin or consider dietary changes, rather than adhering to every little thing that the doctor says.
Yes. Well, I'm much older than you, though I don't know your age. So I consider myself someone older, but yes, I do think perhaps you're right. The people that are in their 70s, maybe 80s. I also saw with my own parents, actually, my mother is the person that really introduced me to integrative medicine and this holistic way of thinking. And when it came to her pancreatic cancer, she did the traditional chemo, and I do believe it killed her much more quickly than if she had literally done nothing. And it is very interesting that I've seen in my own parents that as they got older or faced with something that that there maybe is more security when the, blank is hitting the fan, to just go with sort of conventional methods and to go against the grain, so to speak.
Yeah, absolutely. And something I like to share with my followers too and my listeners is that I think conventional medicine has its place, right? It's great for short-term acute problems, but I think for more chronic illnesses like autoimmune and even cancer, I consider cancer a chronic illness, it can often do more harm than good. And I feel like across the spectrum, conventional doctors use this very short-term myopic approach, right? And as soon as you squash one thing, something else comes up.
Well, absolutely. That certainly, it's certainly what is going on. And it's the reason that I became an ER doctor. It was really the only part of conventional medicine that I really felt that I could do honestly and believe in. If you get shot or you're in a car accident, you absolutely want to go to the ER, right. And you don't want to be working with functional medicine in these acute phase situations. But yes, when it's coming to more chronic conditions, I do not believe that conventional medicine really does a good job there.
What is your take on the whole debate between genetics versus epigenetics in the development of autoimmune disease? And for listeners who aren't familiar with the term epigenetics, can you explain what that is?
Sure. At one point back when I was in school, we believed that our genes were static and that if you had a gene that for rheumatoid arthritis, you were likely going to eventually get rheumatoid arthritis. We now know that we can influence our genes through our thoughts, through our actions, through the food we eat, through supplementation. We can turn genes on and turn genes off. We're also now discovering that people who do not have celiac genes can get diagnosed with celiac. So the other end of the spectrum is people who do not have genes are actually starting to get diagnosed with certain autoimmune conditions. So are there genes that we're unaware of, or is this just the power of our environment? The research that I often quote is that 25% of autoimmunity is genetic and 75% is our lifestyle and the environment. And, some people might feel overwhelmed by that, but I like to think of it as very empowering. It means that you really have 75% of it is in your control.
Absolutely. I love that. And you walked right into my next question. What are some of those environmental triggers or lifestyle factors that are contributing to this increase in autoimmune disease that we're seeing today?
So I like to think of it as, well, I have the 4 pillars of the Myers way, or I like to think of it as a pie chart as well. And that is looking at the foods we're eating, our leaky guts, infections, latent infections such as Epstein-Barr and herpes, or maybe even COVID now. And then we have stress. So what am I missing? And toxins, of course. So toxins can be anything from the phthalates and parabens in our skincare products to heavy metals in amalgams to toxic molds. So really, I could have 2 people or 3 people coming into my office with the diagnosis of rheumatoid arthritis. And one may have leaky gut and a gluten sensitivity, and somebody else may have mercury overload, and somebody else may have, traumatic stress or something like that. I mean, generally you have some amount of all of them because we're human and it's the world we live in, but it's really what are the ones that are most pronounced for you? And, which are the ones that we really need to approach first or dive into the most?
Yeah. Interestingly, if you type in intestinal permeability and autoimmune disease on PubMed, more than 14,000 studies come up. So given that over 70% of our immune system is located in our guts, would you say that everyone that has an autoimmune condition also has a gut problem?
Yes, leaky gut. I mean, Alessio Fasano was on the cover of Scientific America. This was more towards, I believe it was diabetes back then. That must have been 20 years ago now, for saying that there's sort of this 3-prong approach to autoimmunity. And one is leaky gut, genetics, and then some sort of environmental trigger, whether that's stress, an infection. I mean, many people who have an autoimmune condition and even cancer, you can sort of go back a year, maybe 2, and say, what happened to them? My mother died. And then, very shortly thereafter, my mother died very suddenly within 4 months. Shortly thereafter, I was diagnosed with Graves' disease. So many people have a story of a trigger, or people who have an autoimmune condition that maybe they have under control and then they get a trigger. I know for me, toxic mold is a big trigger for me. I can see my autoimmune markers, some, and depending on the severity of it, go up when I'm exposed to toxic mold. So people often will tell you who have something that might wax and wane that as they're exposed to a stressful event, an illness, that they might have a flare. And this is, very common. So it is the reason that Heal Your Gut is the first chapter in my book, because it's the first step. And when people would call and my practice was full and I had a long waiting list, and they'd say, well, how do I find somebody in my area? So, well, the first question you want to ask them is, if you could only do one lab test on me, what would it be? And if it's not a comprehensive stool test, go the other direction. A lot of people think about heavy metals and they'll get on a phone call with somebody and they'll say, oh, you need IV chelation. Well, if you haven't healed your gut, you definitely don't want to do that. So I would tell people run in the other direction. That's definitely not what I would do. The gut is really the gateway to your health, and it's the foundation of your health. And if your gut isn't healthy, it's very difficult for you to be healthy.
Absolutely. And I think one of the distinguishing characteristics of both leaky gut and autoimmune disease is their progressive nature, right? So leaky gut typically starts off as like general gut inflammation, but over time it can advance to nutrient malabsorption and, food or other chemical sensitivities, which is why it is so important to address it early on. And Dr. Myers, you're going to laugh. I actually met Dr. Fasano, 5 or 6 years ago when I lived in Boston. I lived across the street from Massachusetts General Hospital. And at the time, heard about leaky gut. I wanted to go see him. So I sat with him for a good hour, just picking his brain. And quite honestly, that opened up my eyes. And that actually led me to give the GAPS diet a try.
It's not something that I generally prescribe to people because there is a yogurt that is involved in that diet. And I generally recommend people get off of dairy.
I stayed clear of dairy when I was on it, but I just really increased my consumption of bone broth, boiled vegetables, boiled meats. I basically omitted any type of like legumes for a while. So it's kind of like a short-term elimination diet, but I found that it actually reversed my chronic idiopathic urticaria. No doctor could really identify a root cause for. So it worked for me. But with that, I mean, are there any specific trigger foods that you recommend folks looking to heal from a leaky gut completely give up outside of dairy and gluten?
Well, dairy and gluten, particularly if you have autoimmunity, are the two biggest no's that I recommend because of molecular mimicry, that say your thyroid molecules, or the molecules that make up your thyroid, look very similar to gluten, and your immune system can get confused. And then the gluten can look very similar to casein. So in general, the diets that I recommend in my books as well are very similar to that. Bone broth, of course, to heal, getting rid of grains and legumes. And of course, nightshades, nightshades at least for 30 days. So I recommend you get rid of all of those very inflammatory and toxic foods for 30 days. Now, patients that came in that were very severe and unable to tolerate things, I would do something like a modified diet, GAPS diet, where they're really cooking their food to death. So it's very easily digestible. They're putting things in smoothies. So it's already sort of pre-blended, pre-digested. Of course, I would ask them to add in I was using the 4R program to heal your gut. So if you were, missing HCl, or many people needed digestive enzymes, at least from the get-go, to help them overcome and heal their gut. And then, as you begin to feel better, as you begin to heal your gut, as you begin to reverse your autoimmunity, as you begin to get off your medications, if you're on any immunosuppressive drugs, as your antibodies begin to lower and go away, you can broaden those things out, as I'm sure you don't continue to eat the GAPS diet, every day now because you've healed yourself. But, if you get exposed to something or you go through something traumatic and you're fine, I coined the term, the autoimmune spectrum, back in 2000. Well, the book came out in 2015. So if you're low on the spectrum, you can begin to eat more things. If you rise on the spectrum, you really need to go full force back into what I call the Myers way. Some people call it AIP. It's somewhat of a modified GAPS. And, it may be an ebb and flow throughout your life, right? That you can tolerate more things. When we initially moved to Santa Fe, the air was much better here. And so I could find that I could tolerate more things here, chemicals and smells and things that I couldn't tolerate in Austin, where I believe the air is very polluted. That's the whole point of going through these things and adding back in the foods and figuring out what can you tolerate? Because everybody's an individual. But yes, in general, certainly gluten and dairy. And then depending on where you are on the spectrum as to whether you can, tolerate any grains or legumes. Early on, generally no. And I do recommend people get them out, at least for 30, 60, 90 days until they begin to move back down that autoimmune spectrum.
I was just going to ask you that. Is that the typical timeline that you see before folks start to notice an improvement in symptoms?
Well, it depends on the person. It depends on what they have, how long they've had it, how much they have. The beginning of my practice, Mark Hyman was a mentor for me early on. And he said, after an ER doctor, I never had to see the patients again, right? Like you saved their life, they left, you never saw them again. Or you hope to, in a joking way that, there was no continuity of care, right? And so here I was, I'd gone into emergency medicine. I was starting this clinic where people were going to pay me cash. They were going to come back. I needed to make sure they got well. He said, don't worry. 80% of the people get well just on the elimination diet alone. And that was true in the beginning. I was seeing people with a simple migraine or irritable bowel. Again, I'm not diminishing any of these people, but compared to what I ultimately was seeing after writing the autoimmune solution, and people were traveling from all over the world, I was seeing the people with the 5, 6, 7, 8 autoimmune conditions, been everywhere, and I'm their last resort. So, if you're dealing with something relatively simple, it literally can be 30, it can be a few days. I mean, I had people who got off gluten and dairy for the first time of their lives and, calling back saying in 3 days that they've never, migraine free for the first time in 10 years, to when you're dealing with people who have multiple autoimmune conditions. They've read the book. There was a long waiting list to get in. So they've begun the program in the book and they've already done all of that. It can take much longer and you have to dig a lot deeper and use a lot more tools in the toolbox that you maybe don't need to use with somebody who's dealing with something, just one condition that isn't even an autoimmune condition. So everybody, it varies, but certainly if by about the fourth or fifth visit, we were not having a significant impact in their symptoms, I was really scratching my head because, I felt it my duty to get people well and to get them well very quickly if I could.
That makes sense. And on the topic of gluten, so I have a gluten intolerance. There's obviously people out there who suffer from celiac disease. Should people who do not have any type of intolerance or allergy to gluten, right? This is the golden question. I feel like everyone has different opinions on this. Should they be avoiding gluten indefinitely for life? And we also hear these stories of people who travel to Europe, for example, consume gluten, they don't have a problem, right? And then they come back to the States and all of these symptoms appear. So what is your take on that?
So I too have had the privilege of sitting with Dr. Alessio Fasano. I've hosted 2 different summits and he's been on both of those. His belief is that gluten causes, our modern day gluten or modern day wheat causes leaky gut in everybody every time you eat it. But if you're dealing with a healthy individual, our gut cells naturally turn over every 48 hours, 72 hours, and that, your body can heal that. So there's a couple of things that have happened, which is that we've hybridized our wheat. So now it has way more gluten in it than it used to. It's all sprayed with Roundup now. We're living in a toxic world. We have leaky guts. So I'll use my daughter as an example, and she's adopted. And I do know that she has the genes for celiac, but I didn't know that when she was born. I've discovered that, but I've kept her virtually gluten-free her whole life just because of everything that I know about it. And so there is a theory about, for someone, say like my daughter who has the genes, isn't, can eat it and not display any symptoms, that actually is better to maybe give it to her a couple times a year so she doesn't end up truly developing an allergy or something to it. So that's how we treat it. Really, the beginning of her life, she didn't get gluten for the first couple of years. And now I'm from New Orleans and I'll take her to go get beignets. I don't have any. And, I'll let her have a beignet. And so we used to, if there's a birthday party or something, we always bring a gluten-free cupcake, all the stuff. But probably about 2 times a year, I let her have gluten just so that her body sees it, knows what it is, and, kind of knows what to do with it and sort of goes, okay, that's there. Thank you. Goodbye. Instead of turning into a full-blown, allergy for her. So, that's what I've done with my own child that's not a biological child. Now, if she was a biological child, I probably wouldn't give it to her at all because of my history with autoimmunity. My father had autoimmunity. His brother had autoimmunity. Their dad had autoimmunity.
Wow.
So, if she was my biological child, I would not be giving her gluten at all, probably, given my history.
Does she have any dairy in her diet?
No. She was, we're fortunate that we found a surrogate who had just given birth, and the recipients of the baby did not want the breast milk. So we bought breast milk. So she was breast milk fed for her first year of life. And then we moved to camel's milk. And then we just got off everything. She ate a much better diet sort of than she does now, in the sense that she loved vegetables when she was a baby. And, she got her calcium from broccoli and everything. Once they start going to school, it's just very difficult. She still eats a better diet than probably the vast majority of children out there, but
I'm sure
she doesn't love broccoli the way that she used to. She was virtually on a paleo diet for the first couple of years. And so she can do sheep. Well, I can now do sheep, plus minus on the goat. And so she can do sheep and goat. And so she does do some sheep and goat. Those cheeses have really come around, but she's so used to the vegan cheeses that she actually prefers it. When I cook her something with one of the, with the manchego or something,
Yep.
unless it's pizza, because that gluten-free pizza, because that can really melt, she gets upset. She's like, Mommy, I wanted the yellow cheese. I didn't want this cheese. I wanted my cheese. I don't really like to eat that vegan cheese just because of, there's a lot of ingredients in it, but she likes it.
That's a rarity. That's a surprise.
Yeah.
We have similar interests. We should have a pizza party. And Dr. Myer, so you touched on digestive enzymes at one point. Are there any specific supplements that you suggest patients to take when either trying to heal their gut or certainly, reverse autoimmune symptoms?
Well, yes, there are. I do now, I'm retired clinically and I do own a supplement company. So I'll be, speaking about my products, but of course, they can use other products. I mean, ours are formulated by myself based on, my history of working with many, many patients and third-party tested and free of the allergens. But I follow a typical 4R program. So 4R is to remove. The first thing you're removing is the toxic and inflammatory foods. We've already kind of gone over those, but you're also removing any infections. And so it's virtually no one that came to my clinic. I mean, I'm sure there was somebody, but very few people out of the thousands of people that I saw that didn't have SIBO or Candida or both. So I recommend treating those. And of course, I have kits and programs for treating those. And I'll just point out the difference because people do get confused and many people have both. And so with SIBO, the diet is very similar and very similar to the diet that you'll be doing, if you're reading the book or an elimination diet. So a low carb diet. And then with the SIBO, you want to prune back. You have too much bacteria. Too much of a good thing can be a bad thing. And so generally that's too much lactobacillus. And even my probiotics, other than my Primal Earth probiotic, which is a soil-based one, have lactobacillus. So you want to be careful and you don't want to add in a probiotic that has lactobacillus. So I have some herbs that are called Microbe Clear, which is just a blend of different herbs to help prune back that bacteria. And then you want to take, I believe, a soil-based probiotic. Ours is called Primal Earth. So when people start to take a probiotic or when people take prebiotics and they start getting bloated, that's a big key to me that you might have SIBO. Candida, on the other hand, will generally get better with these things with a really comprehensive high-dose probiotic. So that's how I, in some ways, can distinguish the two. I mean, I can get into lots of other ways that I distinguish them. In Candida, I use caprylic acid, a product called CanDefense, which is enzymes to break down the yeast cell wall, and then I use 100 billion unit probiotic. So if you have both of them, I treat the SIBO for 30 days, and then I treat the Candida. Now, you can take the caprylic acid, the CanDefense, and the Microbe Clear all at one time, but you definitely do not want to be taking the 100 billion unit probiotic until you've cleared out that SIBO. So that's remove.
And Dr. Myers, is there a reliable test to assess if someone really has SIBO? There's so many, right? There's so many testing kits out there. Can you clarify this whole area for us?
So actually, I'm in talks about this. Is going to be my whole next book because I don't think anybody's done it so well. So with SIBO, there actually is a gold standard, which is a hydrogen breath test. And you can get that sometimes through your primary care doctor, certainly through a functional medicine practitioner and your GI doctor. What their criteria for ordering it on you is, I don't know, but it is something that there is an ICD-10 code for SIBO now. And so now we have testing, we have coding, and there's treatment, which is Xifaxan, which is an antibiotic, which is very specific to the overgrowth in your gut. And so I've myself taken it several times. I definitely prescribed it in my clinic. The problem is that it's thousands of dollars generally, and most insurance doesn't cover it, or it can be thousands of dollars. Occasionally, we would get somebody's insurance to cover it. So that's why I came up with the product Microbe Clear, because I was having so many patients not be able to get the antibiotics covered. And so, but a hydrogen breath test. There's also a test where you can do a urine test and you can look at some metabolites in your upper gut. And you can also just look at your microbiome and see, is there an overgrowth? You can also have some indicators on a very comprehensive stool test as well. That if you're looking at your microbiome and various microbes being out of balance. So there are other indicators. I also, have a free quiz on my website or in both of my books to, what symptoms do you have? The classic symptom generally for SIBO is I woke up, my stomach was flat, I had a meal, and I looked 6 months pregnant. I mean, that's kind of the extreme, but a lot of people have that. For me personally, I would get constipation with SIBO. So that's an overlooked symptom. Most people think of it as diarrhea or bloating, but you can actually get constipation. And I saw that in myself and a lot of people. So when it comes to Candida, that's a little bit trickier because there is not an ICD-10 code for it. There's systemic Candida, which is basically, a fungal infection in your blood. And that means you're probably in the ICU and on the verge of dying. And that's not what we're talking about here. So you can do some blood markers for Candida. That really just says, are you mounting an immune response? Doesn't tell you where the Candida is, how much you have. It's also only looking very specifically at Candida. So I like to call it yeast overgrowth because Candida is the most common, but you can absolutely have an overgrowth of various types of yeast in your body and in your gut. So again, looking at signs and symptoms, there is some testing, again, that urine test that you can, Genova is the company, that you can see diarrhea if you have metabolites of that in your urine that can show that you have yeast in your upper gut. You can, again, do the blood test, but that's more specific to Candida. And there are also some markers just on a regular CBC. If your neutrophils are high and your white blood cell count is low or your lymphocytes are low, I've had plenty of people going off to oncologists for low white blood cell count